This is an ABC podcast.
He is of no relation to Chuck Norris, the mythical fighter, although
Important
I would claim it
distinction.
if I was Ray.
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
Hey, I'm Gomeroi astronomer Carly Noon,
And I'm deadly Kamilaroi scientist Corey Tutt,
and this is Cosmic Vertigo.
the show that takes a down-to-earth and deadly look at all the sparkly
And the not so sparkly.
stuff in the sky.
So every culture has their own stories and tales passed down through time. For us, we have our songlines.
Today on the show, how one of the world's oldest stories about a cluster of stars in the sky is also one of the oldest astronomical observations.
Story time! One bit of Indigenous astronomy that I absolutely am just fascinated with is everything surrounding Pleiades and Orion. Now, in Gomeroi, Pleiades is Mie Mie, and that Mie means like young girl, Mie means group of girls, and then we have Orion, who is Bire Bire. Singular Bire usually translates to like a young boy or an uninitiated boy, and then again the double use of the term Bire Bire generally represents Orion as a whole. And what's really cool about these stories, wherever you are, whether you're on Gomeroi country, whether you're in Central Desert, whether you're in WA, so many different mobs talk about how the Pleiades are a group of women, usually sisters, and Orion is a hunter.
Is this kind of the story of the Seven Sisters in the sky?
Yes, yeah. Seven Sisters is another name.
I get ya. I've heard this story many times.
I love that you mentioned that. Now, I challenge you and everyone listening
I feel challenged.
to count how many stars you can see in the Pleiades star cluster. We do call it the Seven Sisters in many different countries. Our mob, Kamilaroi people, have lots of different variations of the stories around Mie Mie. One of them talks about one of the girls being invisible. Lots of people talk about this, actually. Often in a story, one of the sisters will be shy or she'll be ashamed, so she'll be in hiding or something like that. There'll be some suggestion that one of the sisters will not be visible. And I really challenge everyone to try and count how many stars they can see. Essentially, if I was to count on a really clear night, give my eyes time to adjust and was focusing really hard with my naked eye, I would probably be able to see maybe 5, maybe 6 if I'm really lucky, but definitely not 7. And this is really cool. This is a really important fact because this has actually been used to date this story. So this little detail, essentially an astronomer, Ray Norris, again, CSIRO.
I know, Uncle Ray Norris. I've got his
Yeah,
book
awesome.
called Emu Dreaming.
Yeah, he's done a lot of work on songlines, and it's really cool from my perspective to have someone who is coming at it from an astronomical perspective. A lot of our stuff kind of sits in other fields, whether it be anthropology or whether it just kind of sit in an Indigenous Aboriginal space. But I love the perspective of coming to this story with an astronomical background because you pick up on things like this, right? You pick up on the fact that this story is often called the Seven Sisters, and yet we can't see 7 stars. So essentially what Ray has done is going back in time, a bit of time travel, and trying to find out when 7 stars would have been visible in our night sky with just the naked eye. And from his research, he has predicted that this story could potentially be about 100,000 years old.
That's incredible. And just for our listeners, and I know I had to ask Ray this myself once, he is of no relation to Chuck Norris, the mythical fighter, although I would claim it if I was Ray. But it's really incredible that how much history we can tell just by looking at the stars. And I think that it's so fascinating that we have over 500 different clans that we know of in Australia, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And every one of those communities has some form of relationship with the stars and has a story very similar to this one, with subtle differences. I find that incredible. And, you know, when we look at history and our mobs, we did have families that crossed between different countries, but actually it's really special that we have these stories today because we didn't have cars back then. You couldn't go and jump on your private jet and go and visit, you know, Wiradjuri mob when you're in Kamilaroi. You actually had to trek hundreds and thousands of kilometers in searing heat and unforgiving terrain, and we had these knowledges that were shared across all the nations, and that is something worth celebrating.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the Seven Sisters feeds into that so much, right? Like the Seven Sisters songlines, you know, one of the songlines, just one of them, almost crosses the entire country, going from East Coast to West Coast. Knowledge of that one songline can help you get from Gomeroi country over in, you know, northwest New South Wales all the way over to WA, say Yamatji country, which is near Geraldton. So incredible. Definitely a story that not only traverses such large distance across Australia, but around the world and through time as well. Now, I mentioned this 100,000 year story, or potentially 100,000 year. This is some initial research. This hasn't been, you know, this isn't for sure. We don't really know. And that's the difficulty of trying to age these things. But all the same, what I find absolutely fascinating, and I know many others, is that this story is kind of mirrored around the world, not just around Australia. So if we think about Greek mythology, now even the
I don't
names,
often think about Greek mythology, but I am now.
as an astronomer, I am often forced to, and you know, it's fine. I don't mind it. I played a lot of Age of Mythology growing up, so
I played a lot of Age of Empires growing up.
Pretty versed. I'm still playing Age of Empires.
Yeah. Shout out to all the Age of Empires fans, friends of the show. And
all
Age of Empires
there.
may or may not be sponsoring Nutrigrain anymore, but they are sponsoring this podcast.
Oh, iconic.
Jokes, they're not.
Actually iconic.
Reach out.
So even the names, you know, Pleiades and Orion come from Greek mythology. And essentially the story related to these two objects in the sky very much mirror the countless Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander stories about these two objects. Basically, Pleiades were said to be the daughters of Atlantis Titan, such an epic name. And their job was to uphold the sky. And because, you know, they were working, they were busy, paying their bills or whatever they get for holding up the sky, and they were too busy to actually take care of their daughters. And so he sent them up into the sky to protect them from Orion, who was a hunter. He was, you know, a bit handsy. He wanted a bit too much. He was a bit aggressive with the girls. And so Atlantis Titan put them up into the sky to protect them from, you know, this handsy male. And that's really similar to so many of the stories here, you know,
Look, if you're going to protect your daughters and send them anywhere, on Earth or outer space, the sky is probably the best place to protect them because, I don't anticipate Orion calling an Uber and getting out to the stars to inflict harm on this daughter that is in the sky.
Yeah, well, depending on what story you kind of, are thinking about, there are many endings. There's one Gamilleri variation where Bere, he does eventually get one of the sisters, and the other sisters turn into these ice maidens, and they send all this really harsh, icy weather to try and basically get their sister back, to try and get Bere out of hiding. They essentially turn everything into ice to try and locate where their sister is. When that doesn't work, they then bring in the warmer weather. They bring in the spring in order to melt all the ice that they have created, again, to try and find their sister. So there are lots of variations of this story, no matter where you are. The Western Desert people, the Kakatha Nation in particular, have an incredible story around Pleiades and Orion. In one of their stories, they have a big sister, Kambagda, and she basically protects the other sisters alongside all of her dingoes. So there's a bunch of dingoes that are also protecting the sisters from the hunter. And what's really cool
Man's best friend and woman's best friend as well.
Hey, I agree. Look,
Shout out to all the dingoes out there on Fraser Island. You're all best friends of the show.
We love you.
Pat soon, bites never.
Aww. And yeah, look, the dingoes did a really good job. They were protecting the sisters. And the elder sister, Kambagda, she was really cool. She had fire magic. And she would attack, basically, Orion with her fire magic. And, he would get upset and he would attack her back. But basically, in this story, it embeds some physical information about these stars that they're talking about. So Kambagda, her fire magic comes out of her foot, and her foot is shown by the star Aldebaran. It's represented by that star. And Aldebaran...
Take that, Orion. You get burnt.
Yeah,
when you overstep the lines of consent, you get foot fire. You get kicked.
Oh, it's so good.
Cop it, Orion. You deserve it.
Oh, it's great. I love to see the justice. But basically, what's really cool about this is Aldebaran, the star, it's called a variable star. And what that means is over time, it'll get bright and then it'll get dim. And it'll get bright again and then it'll go dim. And this is embedded within the story through her fire magic, because what actually happens is she attacks Orion and then Orion attacks her back. And Orion attacks her back with his club, and that club is represented by the star Betelgeuse. Now we know Betelgeuse is also a variable star, and essentially their fire magic cancels each other out. So their attacks and then their retaliation. And this is a way that we see, this physical information about these stars. The fact that they get brighter and then they dim, that has been embedded within the story in a meaningful way that is, it's going to capture that physical information and those observations, but it's also captured in a way that it's memorable. It's a part of this story. It's not just some random piece of information tacked onto it, but it has a purpose and a place within this story. Now, variable stars were only really confirmed to exist in the last century. So it was only kind of mid-1900s that modern day astronomers were able to actually see that variable stars existed. So on one hand, this knowledge is so ancient and has been known about for, many hundreds, if not thousands of years. And then on the flip side, modern day science is only really starting to understand the variable nature of stars.
They're playing catch up.
Yeah.
What they're doing, they're chasing after Usain Bolt, which is blackfella science, But he's too quick for you. He's already finished the race. And
Too wise, too old.
2 hours, and they're trying to use a moped to catch up. And and they little did they know that a 2-stroke motor is not really quite quick enough.
It's got nothing on 65,000 years, unfortunately.
No, he's already done laps around this moped, and he continues to still do laps around the moped.
I think this story is just so incredible, and it shows not just what Indigenous science has to offer, but it tells us that there are different ways of doing things, right? It reinforces that idea that, knowledge can come and go. Knowledge can be discovered, and conversely, it can disappear. The Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islander people here on this continent, they've just had so much time to be able to not just to inform the dreaming stories and the songlines, but to also tailor that knowledge to get a better understanding of it. With each observation, you're getting more and more information about whatever it is you're observing. And when you times that by 65,000 plus years, you get some pretty incredible knowledge, stuff like this. And I find it so inspiring that, our ancestors were a part of this. They really were the first astronomers.
When Carly and I talk about our ancestors, yes, we're direct descendants of this culture, but for all of you non-Indigenous people listening, this is a part of our history, and you should wear it as a badge of honour, because to come from the country whose first people were the first astronomers is a really special thing as well. And it's not an us versus you or an us versus them. It is part of history, and we should embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. We have such an impressive and ancient history here that is still so relevant today. And it just gives me so much pride, that I'm able to be in this space. I'm able to be in astronomy, not just as an astronomer, not just someone who has degrees in physics and maths, but I'm able to be here as a Gamilaroi woman, as an Aboriginal person. And I'm able to celebrate that with everyone else. I'm able to celebrate that with Australia, because it really is something to be so proud of.
Totally. And I think that it's so important that we don't put too much pressure on First Nations academics here in Australia and make them the answer to all the questions that we have, but we actually support them. We get around Carly Noon. We get around people like that, so we can have the next generation of first astronomers coming out.
Yeah.
And, and I want to see kids in Australia beating their chests and being so proud that they come from, they're direct descendants of the first people that were here, that looked at the stars for answers and asked questions as well. And I think that the other thing that's really important about this all is that the sooner we start accepting this history, this factual history that we know is fact, and stop listening to the people that deny it, the closer we'll get as a country.
Yeah.
And some of the things that we have problems with will start to disappear.
Yeah.
But we need to open up our hearts, and we need to open up our minds.
Yeah, that's it. Be open to different ways of doing things, and, acknowledge that there are different ways to do science. There are different ways to understand the world and even the universe, and they can be just as successful as our modern techniques. Now, as a Gamilaroi woman in astronomy, I personally, when I'm thinking about the future, I'm so excited because we have so much opportunity here. If there's anything that I hope this episode is telling people, it's that this is a really good time. If you are interested in space, if you are interested in astronomy or engineering or space tech, anything like that, space law, space ethics, there's so much opportunity here right now in Australia, in your own backyard, to be able to get involved in this.
Yeah, for sure. And my challenge, seeing we're handing out challenges here, like they're going out of fashion, is when you do look at the sky and you look at the stars, just think back that hundreds of thousands of years ago, there were people standing in your position looking at the stars themselves and asking why and asking how and asking, the questions that we have that life brings and trying to find the answers. And I think if you have that, you'll find that when you look at the stars, it'll be a bit more special next time.
Yeah. And we can now contribute to our understanding, right? We can contribute to the understanding that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had of our universe. We can contribute and we can add to that. And really, science is a human endeavor. It's not a Western endeavor. It's not a European endeavor. It's not a NASA endeavor. It's a human endeavor. And that's what this country shows, right? Whether you're mob, whether you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, whether you're not, whether you're non-Indigenous, whether, you identify as Australian, whether you moved here from another country, but you now call it your home. Australia is so representative of just trying to understand, just taking really big leaps and making such big contributions to the human understanding of our world.
Cosmic Vertigo is brought to you by not Boris Johnson, Corey Tutt.
And me, Carly Noon. This season is produced by Ivy Shee.
Joel Werner is executive producer and all-round chef of the show. In fact, I'm eating one of his meals right now.
We hope you enjoyed that story of the Seven Sisters, Mie Mie. There's so much more out there.
If you like what you've heard, leave us a nice review, a deadly review. Tell your friends, your enemies, and maybe write a Reddit blog about the show.
For now, that's it from us. See you soon.
Later.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio, and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.